I came home from work that evening exhausted, smelling like stale groceries and floor cleaner, my feet sore from standing for 8 hours straight. The store had been packed, the kind of night where every shift felt twice as long, and I had spent the last hour counting down the minutes until I could leave. All I wanted was to eat something, take a shower, and collapse in bed. But the second I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet where everyone was just in their own rooms, where the TV hummed in the background and my mom was in the kitchen making something, where Jason was on the phone talking about his future and my dad was reading the paper. No, this was different. The kind of silence that felt deliberate. The kind that made my stomach tighten before I even saw what was waiting for me. Boxes, stacked neatly in the hallway, right by the front door. My duffel bag propped against them. My shoes, ones I always left by the entrance, shoved carelessly into a plastic bag like they were an afterthought. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, my fingers still gripping the strap of my work bag, my body frozen in place. It wasn't just a few things. It was everything. My life, packed up without me. I stepped forward, slowly, like moving too fast would make this real, like if I just took my time, maybe the pieces would rearrange into something that made sense. My mother was standing near the couch, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. My father was beside her, not looking at me, not looking at anything, just staring at the floor like he was already bored of this conversation before it even began. Jason wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. I set my bag down carefully, forcing my voice to stay steady. What's going on? My father exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple like this was some minor inconvenience he was being forced to deal with. We think it's time you moved out. My stomach twisted, a slow, creeping sensation of something cracking open inside me. My mother still wasn't looking at me, but she nodded once, like that made it final, like they had already decided and now all that was left was for me to accept it. I let the words settle, let the weight of them press down, but they still didn't feel real. I swallowed, my throat dry. Moved out, I repeated, as if hearing it again would make it make sense. Just like that? We've already taken care of everything, my mother said, her voice calm. Like she was just handling logistics, like this was a problem they had efficiently solved. The lease is in your name. The first 2 months are covered. You'll be fine. I stared at the boxes again, at the way they had packed up my life like I was just another task to check off a list. Like this was something they had planned long before they bothered to tell me. Why now? I asked, my voice quieter than before. My father sighed, shifting his weight. You're an adult. It's time you start taking responsibility for yourself. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, at the way he said it like he was teaching me some important life lesson, like I hadn't already been taking care of myself for years. I knew what this was. It had nothing to do with responsibility. It had nothing to do with independence. Jason had gotten sick, and suddenly, I mattered. Suddenly, I had a purpose. My blood, my bone marrow, my body had become useful, and I had given them what they needed. I had done everything they asked, had sat through the tests, the procedures, the recovery, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would change things. That once Jason got better, they would finally see me. That maybe I wouldn't just be the extra, the backup, the second-place child they had never really wanted. But Jason had recovered, and that was the end of it. I wasn't needed anymore. I let the silence stretch between us, waiting to see if either of them would break, if either of them would offer something. An explanation, an apology, anything to make this hurt less. But they didn't. I inhaled slowly, steadied my voice. Right, I said, nodding once. Best for everyone, right? Neither of them corrected me. I picked up my duffel bag, slinging it over my shoulder, my movements slow, deliberate. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't ask why they had made this choice so easily. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking I was weak. If they wanted me gone, then fine. I wouldn't make it harder for them. But as I stepped toward the door, my mother spoke again. You should be grateful, you know? I stopped. Grateful. My fingers clenched around the strap of my bag, my jaw tightening as I turned to face her. Grateful? She nodded, still calm, still convinced that this was some kind of gift. Most people your age don't get a head start like this. We're setting you up for success. Something inside me went cold, but I didn't let it show. I didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't ask the questions that were clawing at the back of my throat. I just turned, stepped outside, and shut the door behind me. They didn't follow me. They didn't call my name. I stood on the front step for a long moment, my breath visible in the cold air, my hands tightening around the strap of my bag until my knuckles ached. I had always known, deep down, that I was second. That Jason was the one who mattered. But standing there, staring at the house I had spent my entire life in, the house that no longer belonged to me, I realized something else. I wasn't just second. I was nothing. I exhaled sharply, adjusted the weight of the bag on my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan, but it didn't matter. I didn't have a choice. The apartment they had set up for me was as empty as I felt when I first stepped inside. The fridge hummed loudly in the silence, the single overhead light flickered slightly, and the air smelled like dust and cheap cleaning products. It wasn't home. It wasn't anything. I dropped my bag by the door and stood there for a long time, staring at the boxes stacked against the wall, packed neatly with my life, waiting for me to put everything away and pretend this was normal. I didn't move. I didn't unpack. I just let the weight of everything settle, let the exhaustion sink into my bones, let the realization of what had happened finally hit me in full. They had really done it. They had really sent me away without hesitation, without regret, without anything resembling love. Jason got better, and I became an inconvenience, a loose end that needed to be cut. The first few weeks passed in a blur of work and silence. No one called. No one checked in. No one made any effort to pretend I had ever been part of their lives. I went on my shifts at the grocery store, came back to the apartment, ate whatever I could afford, and repeated the process the next day. The loneliness was expected, but the ease with which they had erased me still felt sharp, like a wound that refused to heal. I had spent years trying to be good enough, trying to matter, but in the end, it had been easy for them. It had been nothing at all. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was on break. The name on the screen made my stomach twist. Jason. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer or let it go to voicemail, whether to ignore him the way he had ignored me, whether to let the silence stretch just a little longer. But curiosity won out, or maybe it was something weaker than that, something desperate and stupid that still wanted to believe I mattered enough for him to call. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. "Hey," he said, his voice too casual, too light, like we hadn't gone weeks without speaking, like nothing had happened. "How's the new place?" I exhaled slowly, forcing my tone to stay neutral. "Fine." Jason hummed like he wasn't really listening, like my answer didn't actually matter. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." There was a pause, a hesitation that told me whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be good. "Mom and Dad are throwing a party for me. A celebration, for the residency program. It's a big deal, and they're inviting a lot of people. I think you should come." I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it, at the way he said it like it was some kind of favor, like I should be grateful to be included in a family event after they had spent weeks pretending I didn't exist. I could already hear my mother's voice in my head, explaining it away to relatives. Of course we invited him. He's still family. It was about appearances, nothing more. I was useful again, but only in the sense that they needed me to play a role, to make everything look picture perfect. I tightened my grip on the phone, forcing down the bitterness rising in my throat. "And why would I do that?" Jason sighed, the familiar sound of his patience thinning. "Because it's not a big deal. It's just one night. You show up, you eat some food, you make small talk, and you go home. It would mean a lot to Mom." That was the moment I did laugh, sharp and humorless. It would mean a lot to Mom? The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, like some kind of joke that no one had told me was funny. The same Mom who threw me out without a second thought? The same Mom who hasn't spoken to me since? You expect me to care about what means a lot to her? "Don't do this," Jason said, his tone shifting, a familiar irritation creeping in, the same frustration he always had whenever I refused to fall in line. "I don't know why you have to make everything so difficult." I leaned back against the break room wall, staring at the cheap tile floor, at the cracks in the surface, at the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. You really don't get it, do you? Get what? Jason's voice was clipped, defensive, like he was already tired of the conversation, like he wanted me to just say yes and make things easier for him. You got better, I said, keeping my voice even, steady, refusing to let him twist this into something it wasn't. And that was the end of it. They didn't need me anymore, so they got rid of me. And now, what? Now they want me back just for one night, so they can pretend everything is fine? So they don't have to answer any uncomfortable questions about why I'm not there? Jason was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke again, his voice was tight, controlled. I thought maybe if you came, things could go back to normal. I closed my eyes, the words hitting me harder than I expected. There is no normal, I said quietly. Not for me. Not anymore. Jason let out a sharp breath, muttering something under his breath that I didn't quite catch. So what? You're just going to keep being a victim? Keep playing the role of the wounded little brother? At some point, you have to move on. I opened my eyes, my grip tightening around the phone. Move on. I repeated. Is that what you did? Is that what you told yourself? That it wasn't your problem? That it wasn't worth caring about? Jesus, Jason muttered, frustration leaking into his voice. I'm trying here, all right? I didn't have to call. I didn't have to invite you. I could have just let it go, but I didn't, because whether you like it or not, we're still family. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remember that Jason had never been the one to care. He had been too focused on his own life, too wrapped up in his own success, too used to being the center of attention. He wasn't calling because he missed me. He was calling because it was convenient. Yeah, I said finally, my voice flat. That's the difference between us. You still think we're a family. Jason didn't say anything after that, just exhaled sharply and hung up. I stared at my phone for a long moment, my chest tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I slid it back into my pocket, stood up, and walked out of the break room. I wasn't going to the party. I wasn't going to play their game. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let them decide what I was worth. The house was too bright, too loud, too full of people who had no idea what had really happened, who had no idea that the only reason I was standing here now was because Jason had asked me to. I moved through the crowd without acknowledging anyone, my stomach tight, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I could hear bits and pieces of conversations as I passed. People talking about Jason's future, about how proud my parents must be, about how everything had worked out perfectly for him. His recovery, his success, his next steps in life. It was all about him. It had always been about him. My mother moved effortlessly through the room, smiling, laughing, playing the role of the perfect hostess, greeting people with warmth that had never once been directed at me. My father stood near the kitchen, drink in hand, speaking in that careful, authoritative tone that made people listen. They were comfortable. They were happy. They had erased me so easily, and now they expected me to stand here, to play along, to act like nothing had ever happened. Jason was talking to a group near the fireplace, nodding at something someone was saying, smiling in that effortless way of his, like he had already won. He had always been the golden child, the one they had built everything around, the one whose existence shaped the way this family functioned. My presence here was nothing more than a formality, a way to keep up appearances, a way to make sure no one asked any uncomfortable questions about why I had been missing from their lives for weeks. I picked up a drink from the table, holding it just to have something to do with my hands. My stomach churned with something sharp, something unsteady, but I didn't let it show. Jason's voice cut through the noise as he excused himself from the conversation and made his way over to me, his expression carefully neutral, his movements slow, deliberate. You actually came, he said, his tone unreadable. I took a sip from the glass, ignoring the way my hand shook slightly. Yeah, figured I should see how the family's doing. Jason exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, like he was already tired of this. Are you planning on making a scene? I let out a sharp laugh, but it wasn't really funny. I don't need to. You all have done a great job pretending nothing ever happened without my help. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he glanced around the room, making sure no one was paying too much attention before stepping closer. I told you. I thought maybe if you came, things could go back to normal. Normal for who? I asked, keeping my voice even. For you? For them? Because normal for me was realizing that I was nothing more than a spare part in this family. Normal for me was waking up in an empty apartment with no calls, no texts, no one checking in. Normal for me was understanding that the only time I exist to any of you is when you need me for something. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't deny it. I felt the weight of it then, heavier than before, heavier than it had been when I was standing outside this house wondering if I should even bother coming in. There was no apology waiting for me here. There was no explanation that would make it hurt less. They had done what they did because it was easy, because it was convenient. And now, here I was, standing in the middle of a celebration that had nothing to do with me, surrounded by people who had no idea that I had been discarded like I was nothing. A voice cut through the noise, sharp, familiar. My mother. Jason. She was moving toward us now, smiling, but there was something forced about it, something tight around the edges. She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning back to Jason. Come say hello to the Wallaces, they just arrived. Jason hesitated for a second, looking at me, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair before nodding. Yeah, give me a second. She smiled, like everything was fine, like nothing was wrong, before walking away, already shifting back into her perfect role, already focusing on the next thing that needed to be done. Jason exhaled, his eyes flicking back to me. Don't do anything stupid. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, waiting to see if he would say anything else, if he would break even a little, if he would show any real emotion about what had happened. But he didn't. He just nodded once and turned away, walking toward our mother, slipping back into the life that had never had room for me. I watched him go, the weight in my chest pressing down harder than before, my breath slow, measured. I should have left then. I should have walked away, gotten in my car, and never looked back. But instead, I turned and made my way toward the kitchen, my heart pounding harder with every step. My father was still standing there, speaking to a group of men, laughing at something one of them had said. He hadn't noticed me yet. He hadn't acknowledged me once since I arrived. I stepped forward, standing just close enough that he couldn't ignore me. He finally turned his head, his expression unreadable. Are you enjoying yourself? His voice was smooth, polite, as if I were just another guest, as if I weren't his son. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling something sharp clawing its way up my throat, something I had been holding back for too long. Why did you do it? His face barely shifted, but something flickered behind his eyes. Do what? You know what, I said, my voice low, steady. You didn't just push me out. You erased me. You didn't call. You didn't check in. You didn't even pretend to care. I want to know why. The conversation around us had quieted slightly, people noticing the tension, sensing something wasn't right. But my father didn't look fazed. He exhaled through his nose, setting his drink down carefully before meeting my gaze again. You're an adult, he said simply. We gave you everything you needed to stand on your own 2 feet. It was time for you to take responsibility for yourself. I stared at him, waiting for something more, waiting for him to say something real. But that was it. That was all he had to give. A slow breath left my lungs as I nodded once, understanding something I should have known all along. Right? I said, my voice quiet. Best for everyone, right? He didn't answer. I turned away, making my way back through the crowd, past the people who had no idea what had just happened, past Jason, past my mother, past all of it. The house that had once been mine, the place I had spent my entire life trying to belong in, was nothing but a shell now, and I was done trying to fit inside it. I walked out the front door without looking back. The cold night air hit me the second I stepped outside, but I didn't stop walking. My hands were shaking, my chest was tight, and my pulse was hammering against my ribs in a way that made it hard to think clearly. I should have just left. I should have gotten in my car and driven away without looking back. But instead, I stood there at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house that had once been mine, listening to the muffled sound of laughter and conversation spilling from inside. It was like nothing had happened, like my presence, or my absence, didn't change a damn thing. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing. Just like the last few months. Just like the moment they had shut the door behind me and never looked back. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat, forcing myself to breathe through it, to push it down, to remind myself that I hadn't come here looking for some grand reunion. I had come to see the truth. And I had. The door creaked open behind me, and I heard the footsteps before I turned around. Jason. Of course it was Jason. He didn't speak right away, just stepped closer, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense like he was bracing himself for another argument. "You just walked out," he said finally, his voice low, careful. I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head as I turned to face him. "Yeah, that's kind of what happens when you're not actually wanted somewhere." Jason exhaled slowly, glancing back at the house for a moment before looking at me again. "You think I don't get it?" I scoffed, the sound bitter. "You don't get it. You never have." His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he was going to snap, but he didn't. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. "I didn't ask them to do that to you," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't tell them to kick you out." I let the words hang between us, waiting to see if he had anything else to add. When he didn't, I just shook my head. "Yeah? But you didn't stop them either." Jason's silence was answer enough. I took a step back, suddenly exhausted, suddenly aware of just how pointless this conversation was. "Why are you even out here, Jason? You got what you wanted. The perfect party. The perfect family. The perfect life. What do you need from me?" His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Frustration, maybe, or guilt, or something else he didn't want to admit. "I don't need anything from you," he said, but there was hesitation in his voice. I didn't want it to be like this." I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. "Then maybe you should have done something about it when it actually mattered." Jason shifted, looking like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to fight me on this, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, waiting for something, even though I didn't know what. The door opened again, and this time it was my mother. She didn't step fully outside, just hovered in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to keep herself warm even though I knew she wasn't cold. Her gaze flickered between me and Jason, but she didn't look surprised to see me out here. She had always had a way of appearing at the exact moment she wanted to, never a second before, never a second after. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice unreadable. I stared at her, waiting to see if she would add anything, if she would try to stop me, if she would say something, anything, that acknowledged what they had done. But of course, she didn't. I exhaled slowly, stuffing my hands into my jacket pockets. "Yeah," I said finally. "I am." She nodded once, like that was the expected response, like she had already known it was coming. "All right." That was it. "All right." Not "I'm sorry." Not "you should stay." Not "we made a mistake." Just "all right," like I was some acquaintance at a dinner party saying my goodbyes. Like she wasn't watching her own son walk away for what might be the last time. Jason shifted beside me, glancing at her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't say anything. He didn't try to convince her. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He just stood there, letting it happen. I swallowed against the lump rising in my throat, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "You didn't even try to check on me." My mother blinked, but her expression didn't change. "We knew you'd be fine." I let out a short laugh, but it didn't hold any humor. "Of course you did." Jason exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Look, can we not do this here?" I turned to him, my patience finally snapping. "Where else would we do it, Jason? When else would we do it? You wanted me here tonight. Well, here I am. So let's stop pretending for once in our lives and just say it. What I did for you was the only thing that ever made me important to them. The second I wasn't needed anymore, they threw me out like garbage. And you? You stood there and let it happen." Jason's expression darkened, and for the first time, he actually looked angry. "You think I had a choice? You think I could have changed anything? They don't listen to me any more than they listened to you." I shook my head, the anger in my chest burning hotter. The difference is, they still love you. They still keep you around. They still want you here. They never wanted me, Jason. And you know that. Jason opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but he didn't, because we both knew I was right. My mother finally sighed, shifting her weight like she was already done with this conversation. This isn't the time for this. Yeah, I said, stepping back toward the driveway. It never is it? Jason watched me go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his shoulders tense. My mother didn't move. She just stood there, staring, waiting for me to leave so she could go back inside and pretend this hadn't happened. I gave them one last look, just long enough to see if there was even the smallest trace of regret, the smallest sign that this meant something to them. But there wasn't. I turned, walked to my car, and got in. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe past the pressure in my chest. I had thought maybe, just maybe, there would be something left to salvage. That maybe Jason would say something that changed things. That maybe my mother would finally look at me like I mattered. But they never did. I stared at the house for a long time, watching the warm glow of the lights, the shifting shadows of people moving inside, the life that had continued on without me like I had never been there at all. Then, without another word, I started the car and drove away. I drove without thinking, the streetlights blurring past the windshield, my grip tight around the steering wheel. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to get away from that house, from the weight of Jason's voice in my ears, from the blank look on my mother's face, from the truth I had spent years trying not to acknowledge. They had never really wanted me. I had been convenient when they needed me, disposable when they didn't. And the worst part wasn't that they had kicked me out. It was that they had never looked back. The anger had settled into something heavier, something cold, something that made my hands tremble even as I tried to push it down. I had spent my whole life trying to be enough, trying to be seen, trying to be part of a family that had never really included me. And for what? So I could stand in that house like a stranger, like an outsider, like someone they barely recognized? So I could hear my own mother say, without hesitation, that she had known I'd be fine, that she hadn't even considered reaching out. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, killing the engine but making no move to get out of the car. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, the parking lot mostly empty except for a few cars scattered near the front. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment, forcing my breathing to even out. It should have been freeing, knowing I had nothing tying me to them anymore. It should have made me feel lighter. But all I could think about was how easy it had been for them to let me go. The knock on my window made my eyes snap open. I turned, my heart hammering, expecting to see Jason, expecting some last-ditch effort to smooth things over. But it wasn't him. Ashley. I hadn't even told her I was coming to the party, but she had always been able to tell when something was wrong, always had a way of showing up exactly when I needed her. She gave me a look through the glass, raising an eyebrow like she was waiting for me to roll the window down. I sighed, reaching over to unlock the door instead. She pulled it open, slipping into the passenger seat without waiting for an invitation, folding her arms over her chest as she studied me. "You look like hell," she said. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Feels about right." She didn't say anything for a moment, just watched me, waiting, letting the silence stretch until I finally exhaled and leaned forward, resting my arms against the steering wheel. "I shouldn't have gone," I muttered. "I knew it wouldn't change anything." Ashley shifted, tucking one leg under herself. "But you had to see it for yourself." I nodded, jaw tightening. "Yeah." She glanced out the windshield, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee. "So? What happened?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words, trying to explain something that still felt too raw to put into sentences. "Jason wanted me there," I said finally. "Or at least, he wanted me there so they wouldn't have to explain why I wasn't." Ashley made a quiet, unimpressed sound. "Of course he did." I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. It was like I was a stranger. My mom barely looked at me. My dad acted like I was some problem he had already solved. "Jason," I stopped, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Jason still thinks this can all just go back to normal." Like I should just pretend everything's fine because it's easier that way. Ashley was quiet for a long time, her gaze steady, unwavering. And what do you think? I swallowed, my throat tight. I think I'm done. The words sat between us, final and certain, the weight of them pressing down on my chest even as something in me finally started to settle. I had spent so long waiting for them to care, waiting for them to reach out, waiting for some moment that would prove I still mattered to them. But that moment was never coming. Ashley reached over, squeezing my wrist gently. Good, she said. You should be. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze, searching for any hint of pity, but there was none. Just understanding. Just quiet acceptance. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. What now? She shrugged. Now, you stop wasting your time on people who don't deserve you. Now, you start figuring out what you want instead of what they wanted for you. Now, you let them go. I let those words sink in, rolling them over in my mind, feeling them settle into something real, something solid. Let them go. I had spent my whole life fighting for a place in a family that had never really been mine. I had fought to be noticed, to be included, to be seen. But I didn't have to fight anymore. I sat back, inhaling slowly, staring out at the empty parking lot. Yeah, I said finally. I think I will. Ashley smiled, small but real, then reached over and grabbed the keys from the ignition. Good. But first, you're coming inside. You look like you haven't eaten in days, and I'm not dealing with your emotional breakdown on an empty stomach. I snorted, shaking my head as she pushed open her door and climbed out. She was already halfway to the diner before I even moved, her pace casual, unbothered, like she already knew I would follow. And for the first time in a long time, I did. I got out of the car, shut the door behind me, and walked toward something better.